London, late 19th century. The city breathes fear. The streets, shrouded in thick fog, seem to swallow the flickering glow of gas lamps. Dark alleys conceal secrets, and every step echoes like a whisper of terror. Amidst this grim setting, an unknown figure emerges from the shadows, turning the Whitechapel district into a living nightmare. No one knew who he was. He was never caught, never clearly seen, but his name echoed like a muffled scream through the ages. Jack the Ripper, a faceless killer. A mystery that was never solved. More than 100 years had passed, and yet he still seems to watch us from the shadows. A dozen gruesome murders have been linked to this same man, 11 women brutally slain over time. Yet only 5 of those victims were definitively connected to the horror left behind by Jack the Ripper. Who was this monster? Why was he never captured? What was he hiding? The answers may be closer than we think. Imagine walking through narrow, shadowy streets where the fog not only covers the path but seems to conceal whispers and watching eyes in the dark. That was Whitechapel in 1888, the heart of a nightmare pulsing in the midst of the Victorian era. London was expanding rapidly, transforming into one of the world's largest metropolises. On the surface, high society balls and candlelit dinners gave the city a glamorous sheen. But just a few streets away, one would plunge into a brutal reality. In the eastern part of the capital, Whitechapel was a living portrait of misery. More than 80,000 people crammed into filthy tenements, living side by side with rats, disease, and the constant stench of decay. Poverty wasn't just visible, it screamed from every corner. Entire families slept on dirty straw or the cold floors of windowless shacks. Clean water was a luxury. Having a meal every day was a challenge. Children as young as 5 or 6 worked in factories or sold matches on the sidewalks. And when there was no work, which was often only 2 options remained: crime or prostitution. Whitechapel became a maze of suffering. Alcohol flowed freely through alleys and in underground taverns, numbing the pain of a forgotten population. Crime was routine. Theft, beatings, even murder happened in plain sight. And the police? Rare, unprepared, and more often than not, entirely absent. There were so few officers patrolling the area that many residents didn't even bother calling for help. It was in this chaotic backdrop that perfect targets emerged for a predator. Poor women, abandoned by the system, without family, without protection, many forced into prostitution for a few coins or a warm bed for the night. These women, invisible to society, became easy prey for someone like Jack the Ripper. A killer who knew that in such a cruel London, one more woman dead in a dark alley would hardly raise alarm. But while the city slept in fear, the press came alive. Sensationalist newspapers fed off the horror, splashing blood-soaked headlines, spreading wild theories, and stoking the flames of panic. Without realizing it, they turned Jack into a legend, a mythological figure who seemed to know every shadow, every alley, every breath of Whitechapel. But the fear that gripped the city wasn't just of a killer on the loose. It was the fear of living in a place where human life was worth almost nothing. Jack was only the spark. The barrel had been full for a long time. London built the stage, poverty wrote the script, and inequality was the perfect backdrop for the birth of one of history's greatest enigmas. Before her name became synonymous with terror, Mary Ann Nichols was just another soul struggling to survive on the cold streets of London's East End. Her life, marked by abandonment, poverty, and quiet resilience, reflects the darkest corners of the Victorian era. In the end, it was precisely this social invisibility that made her the perfect target for a killer who seemed to choose his victims with surgical precision. Mary Ann was born on the 26th of August, 1845. The daughter of Edward Walker, a humble carpenter, she grew up in a modest but relatively stable home in Soho, a neighborhood where luxury and hardship walked side by side. As a young woman, she married William Nichols, a book printer. The couple had 5 children, and for a while, life seemed to follow a predictable path, simple but secure, until everything fell apart. Some say the marriage was destroyed by Mary Ann's drinking. Others claim William betrayed her with a nurse. In the end, it hardly mattered. The result was the same. Mary Ann was left behind. With no husband, no income, and few opportunities, She fell into the same cruel trap that ensnared so many women of her time: prostitution as the only way to secure the bare minimum: a bed, a meal, perhaps a little warmth. Alcohol, already present in her life, became a constant companion. Public shelters became her most frequent refuge. She slept wherever she could, when she was able, and wandered through Whitechapel like just another lost shadow among thousands. On the streets, she was known as Polly Nichols. Even in misery, acquaintances said she was kind, polite, and still showed traces of vanity. She tried to stay clean, presentable, even though she owned only one set of clothes. On the night of the 30th of August, 1888, Polly was turned away from a lodging house because she lacked the 4 pence needed for a bed. With a bitter smile, she reportedly told the attendant, "I'll be back soon. I've already made my DOS money 3 times today. I just need one more customer." It was the last time anyone saw her alive. In the early hours of the 31st of August, around 3:40 a.m., a carman named Charles Cross found her body lying in Bucks Row, a dark, secluded street. At first glance, she looked like just another woman passed out from drink. But the horror was only beginning. Mary Ann's throat had been slit from ear to ear with such force that she was nearly decapitated. Her abdomen had been viciously opened, the mutilations so deep that even seasoned police officers were visibly shaken, and yet her face was calm. It is believed she was taken by surprise. She died in silence. No scream, no chance to fight back. The brutality of the murder shook even the most hardened residents of Whitechapel. This was different, more savage, cold, calculated. But neither the police nor the newspapers had any idea that this was only the first act in a bloody spectacle that would last for months. The first trace of a phantom who would soon gain a name that would never be forgotten: Jack the Ripper. And so Mary Ann Nichols, a woman ignored by society and life, became the first known victim of one of history's most chilling mysteries. Her death made headlines, but her life, like so many others, only gained significance when it was violently stolen in the silent shadows of London. She was born Eliza Ann Smith, but history would remember her by another name, the one that followed her to her final breath: Annie Chapman. Annie came into the world in September 1840 in London. The daughter of a British Army soldier, she had a modest but somewhat supported upbringing. In her early years, she attended boarding schools, a rare privilege for girls of that era. For a time, it seemed the future was on her side. As a young woman, she married John Chapman, a coachman in service to a nobleman. The couple lived with a degree of comfort in Windsor. They had 3 children, but life soon began to exact its toll. One son was born with disabilities and was sent to an institution. One daughter died young. Little by little, those tragedies eroded their relationship and broke Annie from within. Over the years, she and her husband sank together into alcoholism. By 1884, the marriage had collapsed. John continued to send her a small weekly allowance to help her get by until 1886, when he died of tuberculosis. With him went Annie's last thread of stability. No support, no money, no health. Annie began scraping by however she could, selling flowers, mending clothes, and like so many other impoverished women in Whitechapel, turning to prostitution to survive. She stayed in cheap lodging houses, often sharing space with complete strangers. Sometimes she found shelter with acquaintances. Her daily life became a constant struggle for a few coins, a place to sleep, one more day. Sick, frail, exhausted. Tuberculosis made her cough up blood. Malnutrition sapped what little strength she had left. Yet Annie continued roaming the streets of Spitalfields, trying to sell anything or find a client to earn the 4 pence she needed for a bed. In the early hours of the 8th of September, 1888, Annie was turned away from the lodging house on Dorset Street because she couldn't pay for the night. Like Mary Ann Nichols before her, she left behind a phrase that still sends chills: "Don't worry, I won't be long. I'll get the money quickly. Keep my bed for me." Not long after, she was seen talking to a well-dressed man in a hat outside 29 Hanbury Street. It was 5:30 in the morning. Minutes later, Annie Chapman was dead. Her body was found in the backyard of the residence. She was lying on her back, legs spread, her throat cut down to the bone and her abdomen completely mutilated. But this time there was something more, something even more disturbing. The killer had removed her uterus with mere surgical precision. The cut was so clean, so technical, that some investigators began to suggest perhaps the killer had knowledge of anatomy, maybe even medical training. The crime scene was both savage and meticulously silent. No one heard a sound, no one saw a thing. The murder had been committed just steps away from where entire families slept and not a single soul noticed. Once again, the police had no leads. Once again, the press turned horror into spectacle. And once again, a woman forgotten by society was brutally murdered, only to be remembered afterward as another piece in the sequence of crimes that would bring London to a standstill. The 30th of September, 1888. A cold, damp night, wrapped in a thick, suffocating silence, as if the city were holding its breath in anticipation of something terrible about to unfold. But before the blood and the panic, there was Elizabeth Stride, a woman who bore not only scars on her body but deep ones on her soul. Born Elizabeth Gustafsdotter on the 27th of November, 1843, in Sweden, she grew up in the countryside and, at 16, moved to the city of Gothenburg. There, she worked as a domestic servant, trying to build a better life. But times were hard. Still young, she became involved in prostitution and spent time in a rehabilitation asylum. At 23, tired of the life she was leading, she made a bold decision. She left her homeland behind and boarded a ship to London. In the English capital, Elizabeth reinvented herself. She learned the language, married John Stride, a respectable carpenter, and together they opened a small coffee shop in the neighborhood of Poplar. For a brief moment, Elizabeth knew stability. But it wouldn't last. Financial troubles, constant arguments, and the shadow of alcoholism destroyed the marriage, and with it the fragile structure she had worked so hard to build. Alone, sick and penniless, Elizabeth ended up where so many others had, on the streets. She survived doing odd jobs, cleaning houses, selling flowers, and eventually returning to prostitution. She earned the nickname Long Liz. She was tall, thin, with striking features and a proud demeanor. She refused charity, even when starving. Known for her kindness, she could also be fierce when drunk. In her final days, Elizabeth was staying in common lodging houses, getting by with whatever she could earn. On that night of the 30th of September, she was seen wandering the streets of Whitechapel drunk, yes, but still speaking with acquaintances, still trying to hold on to some shred of dignity amidst the chaos. At 6:30 p.m., she was seen on Berner Street. Throughout the night, several witnesses claimed to have seen her with different men, a detail that would later complicate the investigation's timeline. Around 1 a.m., a carman named Louis Diemschutz drove his cart into the yard at Dutfield's yard. When his horse suddenly refused to go any further, he got down to see what was blocking the way. There, in the dark, he found the body of Elizabeth Stride. Her throat had been slashed. The blood was still fresh, but something about the scene was strange. There were no mutilations, no abdominal cuts, no organs removed, none of the savage trademarks associated with Jack the Ripper. That's when a theory emerged. Perhaps Jack had been interrupted. Perhaps Diemschutz's unexpected arrival had startled him, forcing the killer to flee before he could finish where he started. A murder interrupted. But for Elizabeth, it made no difference. She died right there, in the cold silence of the early morning, alone. To this day, experts debate whether Elizabeth was truly one of Jack's victims. The absence of mutilation raises doubts. Some believe she may have been killed by someone else entirely. But what weighs heavily is what came next. Just 45 minutes later, another woman, Catherine Eddowes, would be murdered with extreme brutality. As if Jack, frustrated by the unfinished first kill, had decided to make up for it with a second, even bloodier death that same night. And so, Elizabeth Stride entered history as the only woman attributed to Jack the Ripper whose body was not mutilated. A detail that, to this day, fuels debates, doubts, and endless theories. If there was still any doubt that London was facing a methodical, merciless, and increasingly bold killer, that doubt died with Catherine Eddowes. It was the early morning of the 30th of September, 1888. In less than 45 minutes, Jack the Ripper would make it clear he was no longer content with just killing. He wanted to elevate the horror to leave a mark. And the woman who would carry that horror on her own body was Catherine. She was born on the 14th of April, 1842 in Wolverhampton, England. Intelligent, witty, sharp-tongued, but her life offered little room for lightness. Catherine lost both parents at a young age and, like so many orphans of that era, was thrown into the charity system. Still, she tried to carve out a path. She moved to London, lived for years with a man named Thomas Conway, and had 3 children with him. The two traveled from town to town selling ballads and street literature, scraping by on the margins. But Catherine's alcoholism and their constant poverty shattered what little stability they had. She left her family behind and began living with a new partner, John Kelly. With him, she shared what little she had: a bed in a cheap lodging house and misery. Catherine was known in Spitalfields for her talkative and polite nature, even on the hardest days. But like so many other women forgotten by London, she drank to endure the cold, the hunger, and the abandonment. On the night of the 29th of September to 30, Catherine was found lying on the ground, drunk, shouting and singing in the streets. She was taken to the Bishopsgate police station, where she remained for a few hours until, around 1 a.m., she was released. According to the officers, she left smiling, even joking, "Time to go see my bloke." And then, she vanished into the fog. Less than 45 minutes later, at 1:45 a.m., her body was discovered in Mitre Square by a patrolling officer. She was just a few yards from the station where she'd been released. And what was found there went beyond anything the city had ever seen. Catherine lay on her back. Her throat had been deeply slashed. Her face was mutilated, with V-shaped cuts on her cheeks. Her abdomen had been brutally opened, her intestines pulled out and laid over her left shoulder. Her left kidney was missing, as well as part of her uterus, all done with surgical precision. All executed there, in a dark square, in under 15 minutes. It was the most brutal murder so far, and perhaps the most daring. Mitre Square was a slightly more guarded area. The killer knew that, yet he still carried out the crime coldly, quickly, and with precision, as if he were growing more confident. The alleys of Whitechapel weren't just the stage for brutal murders. They were the setting for something far darker, a series of coldly calculated crimes, carried out with near surgical precision. Jack the Ripper didn't just kill, he left messages. Silent messages, written in flesh, blood, and mutilation. Each scene felt like a ritual, each body a signature. And still, never a witness, never a sound, never a mistake, as if the darkness itself protected him. From this point on, we dive into the details. But be warned, what lies ahead is not for the faint of heart. Mary Ann Nichols, the 31st of August, 1888. It was nearly dawn when Mary Ann was found lying on Bucks Row, flat on her back. Skirt pulled up. Her throat had been slashed twice, from side to side, with such force that the blade nearly reached her spine. Her abdomen, torn open by 4 deep incisions delivered with brutality, yet undeniable precision. Nothing was heard. No scream, no call for help. Estimated time of the attack, less than 2 minutes. Annie Chapman, the 8th of September, 1888. Annie's body was found in the backyard of a house on Hanbury Street. It was just before 6 a.m. Her throat had been cut to the bone, her abdomen completely opened, the uterus removed, her intestines placed over her right shoulder. The killer seemed to know exactly what he wanted, exactly where to cut. One of the doctors put it plainly: whoever did this understood anatomy. They knew where to find it and how to remove it. Elizabeth Stride, the 30th of September, 1888. Elizabeth was the exception. Found in Dutfield's yard with her throat slashed and nothing more. No sign of abdominal mutilation. That's why many believe Jack was interrupted. Perhaps the sudden arrival of a cart forced him to flee before he could complete his macabre ritual. But he didn't stop. He went looking for another victim that same night, and he found one. Catherine Eddowes, the 30th of September, 1888. Less than an hour later, in Mitre Square, Jack struck again, and this time he went beyond all limits. Her throat had been deeply slashed, her abdomen completely torn open, Her intestines were removed and carefully placed over her left shoulder. The left kidney and part of the uterus were extracted with surgical precision, and the face was disfigured with terrifying accuracy. Symmetrical V-shaped cuts marked her cheeks, a gesture that felt both symbolic and sadistic. One veteran officer summed it up: "It was the most demonic thing I've ever seen." Mary Jane Kelly, the 9th of November, 1888. The last and the worst. Mary Jane was found dead in her own room, at Miller's Court, lying on the bed, her throat slashed all the way to the spine, her face unrecognizable, destroyed down to the bone. The uterus, the heart, the kidneys, the liver, the breasts, all removed. Some organs were placed beside her body, others scattered across the room. It was as if Jack had finally been given the time and privacy to unleash his full fury. The detectives vomited upon entering the room. Mary Jane was torn apart like a doll made of flesh. And unlike the other victims, who died quickly, she was butchered in silence for hours. The pattern Jack's signature. It was from these details that investigators began to understand. This wasn't just violence. It was a pattern, a ritual. Jack the Ripper left unmistakable marks. A deep slash to the throat, always from left to right, as if he held the blade with practiced ease. An abdomen opened with precision, almost always in a straight line. Removal of internal organs, especially the uterus, kidneys, and heart. Intestines or other organs placed on or near the body, like offerings or symbols. No credible witnesses. Not even in patrolled areas. Every attack carried out in total silence. None of the victims screamed. And more, he chose public locations at risky hours, with cold blood, with calm. Some experts suggested he had medical knowledge. Others believed he was a skilled butcher, perhaps even a former military surgeon. But the truth is that no one knows to this day. Jack left no traces, only patterns. And those patterns were so striking, so meticulously constructed, that they turned the killer into something greater than a man. He became a specter, a phantom with a scalpel, a shadow with a thirst for chaos. When he vanished, he left behind more than bodies. He left a signature, and a fear that never left the streets of London. The alleys of Whitechapel were already drowning in fear, but when the letters started to arrive, that fear found a voice. A mocking voice, cynical, written in red ink. And just like that, the monster from the shadows got a name. "Dear boss, I keep on hearing the police have caught me, but they won't fix me just yet." It was the beginning of something bigger. The author described the murders with icy sarcasm. He said he loved his work and taunted the police, promising an even more violent attack to come. But what truly etched this letter into history was the signature at the end. Yours truly, Jack the Ripper. It was the first time that name appeared. Until then, newspapers had simply referred to the killer as the Whitechapel Murderer. But with that signature, the monster gained an identity, a style, a presence. The letter was made public on the 1st of October. Within hours, the name Jack the Ripper was on every headline. It went viral in a time without internet, without radio, without television. All it took was paper and fear. The saucy Jackie postcard, the pleasure of killing. 2 days later, on the 3rd of October, another message arrived. A postcard, written in a similar hand. It was short but blunt. "I was not codding dear old boss when I gave you the tip. You'll hear about saucy Jackie's work tomorrow. Double event this time. Double event." The reference seemed clear. The murders of Elizabeth Stride and Catherine Eddowes committed that same night. What shocked everyone was one chilling detail. The postcard arrived before most of the details had been made public. Suspicion grew. Could the author actually be involved in the crimes? Was he mocking the police? With reason? The From Hell letter. But what came next eclipsed all previous messages. On the 16th of October, George Lusk, president of the Whitechapel Vigilance Committee, received a small package. Inside were two things: a note, scribbled in crude, misspelled English, and half of a human kidney, preserved in alcohol. The note began, "From hell. Mr. Lusk, sir, I send you half the kidney I took from one woman." The writer claimed to have cooked and eaten the other half. And he sent what remained as a joke. No signature, no flair, just raw, pure horror. Communication or manipulation. During the frenzy of the Ripper hunt, more than 600 letters flooded police stations, newsrooms, and private homes. Most were fake morbid jokes, hoaxes, or attention seekers. But 3 of them still stand out to this day. Dear Boss, Saucy Jackie, and From Hell. The big question remains, were they really written by Jack the Ripper? Theory 1, the killer wrote them. Some experts believe they were. They argue that the details in the letters, the tone, the handwriting, and the timing of their arrival all point to the true killer. Especially the Saucy Jackie postcard, which appears to reference details not yet released to the press. Theory 2, the press created Jack. Others claim it all started as a publicity stunt. That the Dear Boss letter was actually written by the Central News Agency to stir panic and, of course, sell newspapers. If true, the greatest criminal legend in history was born from sensationalist marketing. Theory 3, a deranged imitator. There are also those who say the letters came from a twisted voyeur. Someone who never killed anyone but relished the attention, crafting letters based on news reports and pretending to be close to the crimes. Real or not, these letters carved themselves into history as deeply as the killer's blade. They gave fear a voice. They gave the nightmare a name. And they transformed Jack the Ripper from an anonymous murderer into something darker, a legend that would echo through the centuries. Because in the end, Jack didn't just kill with knives, he killed with words. And red ink. The police investigation, chaos, pressure, and failure. While blood still trickled down the cold sidewalks of Whitechapel, the police were struggling to make sense of what was happening. But from the very beginning, everything seemed to go wrong. The investigation that should have caught Jack the Ripper descended into a maze of mistakes, rivalries, and limitations failures that, in the end, cost lives. With each new body found, fear multiplied. But along with it, grew a painful truth. The authorities were always behind. One step too late, one scream too far. Primitive forensic methods. It was the late 19th century. Forensic science, still in its infancy. There was no fingerprint collection, no DNA testing. Not even basic techniques for preserving a crime scene. Police officers stormed into locations with dirty boots, handled bodies with their bare hands, and lit dark alleys with gas lamps dim, flickering, almost useless. Autopsies were rushed, conducted in makeshift rooms. Many reports read more like personal impressions than scientific documents. Deep wounds were described without technical criteria. Estimated time of death was pure speculation. What did the police have? Eyes, instinct, and a city on the verge of collapse. On the other side, a killer who moved like a ghost. One city, 2 police forces, and countless clashes. As if the technical challenges weren't enough, the investigation was crippled by something even more human: ego. London was patrolled by 2 distinct police forces: the Metropolitan Police, covering most of the city, and the City of London Police, responsible for the financial district where Catherine Eddowes was murdered. These institutions did not cooperate. They were rivals, competing for power, prestige, and credit. Instead of sharing information, they clashed. While Jack roamed free, they acted like political enemies. The result? Evidence went missing. Suspects were released. Key decisions were made without coordination. The police didn't fail for lack of effort. They failed out of pride, public frustration, and criticism of the police system. In Whitechapel, tension was already part of daily life. Poverty, disease, violence, it was all part of the landscape. But with the murders, fear turned into anger. With each new victim, pressure mounted. The community demanded answers. Posters were plastered across the city walls. Protests began to emerge. The police, once invisible, became the target, and the government began to fear a social uprising. Sir Charles Warren, the Commissioner of Police, became the symbol of failure. He clashed with journalists, with his superiors, even with his own officers. He was the one who ordered the removal of the chalk message near the bloodied apron of Catherine Eddowes, a crucial piece of evidence, never photographed. The people saw a killer mocking the police. And, from the police. They saw only silence and missteps. The press pressure or sabotage. While the police were lost, the press was celebrating. Sensationalist newspapers turned the murders into spectacle. Jack the Ripper sold papers like nothing before. Each crime was a scandalous headline. Each rumor, a breaking scoop. But the hunger for pay-per-clicks didn't stop there. Some letters sent to newsrooms were published before the police even knew they existed. Others, like the infamous Dear Boss letter, may have been forged by journalists seeking attention and profit. The result? Chaos. Suspects lynched in the streets, false accusations. Entire districts gripped by panic. The line between truth and hysteria was completely erased. And as the city burned with paranoia, Jack the real Jack faded ever deeper into the shadows. The suspects a web of possibilities. When the fog lifted and Jack the Ripper vanished into the shadows, one question lingered over London and echoed across the century. Who was he? More than 100 years have passed. No arrests, no confirmed name. But theories? There was no shortage, some based on evidence, others pure speculation. With each decade, new faces emerged as possible architects of the horror, and with them, new doubts, new conspiracies, and new dead ends. These are the suspects who most divided investigators and fueled the legend. Montague John Druitt, the mysterious barrister. Who was he? A barrister, a teacher. Intelligent, discreet, and mentally unstable. In December 1888, 1 month after the murder of Mary Jane Kelly, his body was found in the River Thames. Suicide. Why is he suspected? His death coincided with the end of the killings. Family members considered him disturbed. A senior police official once called him strongly suspected. The case against him, no concrete evidence. No direct connection to the victims. He may have been just a desperate man and nothing more. Aaron Kuzminski, the disturbed barber. Who was he? A Jewish immigrant from Poland. Barber in Whitechapel. Suffered from psychotic episodes and violent outbursts. Was institutionalized shortly after the murders. Why is he suspected? Had a history of hatred toward women. Was named in personal notes by one of the lead investigators on the case. A 2014 study claimed to have found his DNA on a shawl from the Catherine Eddowes crime scene. The case against him. The shawl may have been contaminated over the years. The DNA study has been heavily criticized by the scientific community. No direct evidence, no confession, no witnesses. Walter Sickert, the obsessed artist. Who was he? A British painter, known for his dark and disturbing artwork. His obsession with the Ripper crimes drew attention years later. Why is he suspected? His paintings often depicted mutilated female bodies. Authors like Patricia Cornwell claim he matched the psychological profile of a serial killer. Cornwell also claims to have found partial DNA from Sickert on letters attributed to Jack. The case against him. He was reportedly out of England during part of the murders. Many experts believe his connection to the crimes was symbolic, not literal. No definitive evidence. Only speculation and paintbrushes. Prince Albert Victor, the royal theory. Who was he? Grandson of Queen Victoria. Second in line to the British throne. Died at the age of 28. And became the center of one of history's most scandalous theories. Why is he suspected? Some claim he went insane after contracting syphilis and murdered prostitutes during psychotic episodes. Other versions suggest he fathered a child with a prostitute and the murders were part of a royal cover-up. The case against him, official records place him outside London on key dates. No evidence, no witnesses, just speculation. Serious historians dismiss this theory as a Victorian fantasy with a taste for scandal. Francis Tumblety, the American charlatan. Who was he? An American who claimed to be a doctor but was nothing more than a fraud. He had a history of extreme misogyny and a shadowy past in the United States. Why is he suspected? Rumors at the time claimed he kept uteruses in jars. He was arrested for indecent acts and fled to the US shortly after the murders. He was on Scotland Yard's radar. The case against him. No real evidence links Tumblety to the crimes. His connection is based on rumors and gossip. He lived the rest of his life in the US without confessing. or disappearing. James Maybrick, the man with the diary. Who was he? A cotton merchant from Liverpool. Died in 1889. More than a century later, in 1992, a diary surfaced allegedly written by him in which he confessed to being Jack the Ripper. Why is he suspected? The diary contains intimate details of the murders and phrases similar to those in the Ripper letters. A watch engraved with the name Jack and the initials of the victims was said to have belonged to Maybrick. The case against him. The diary is widely regarded as a forgery. Experts have pointed out inconsistencies in the language and dates. There's no evidence he was ever in Whitechapel during the murders. The face in the shadows. Perhaps Jack was never just one man. Perhaps he was many, or perhaps no one at all, beyond the silence itself. What unites all these names is doubt. What separates them is the lack of proof. And that is precisely what keeps the legend alive. Jack the Ripper is not just a name, he is the absence of one. And what about DNA? Can science solve it? In 2014, the world held its breath for a moment. A study promised what London had waited over a century to hear: a name, an identity, an answer. Researchers claim to have found mitochondrial DNA from Aaron Kosminski on a shawl supposedly belonging to Catherine Eddowes. For a brief moment, it seemed the most famous case in history might finally be solved. But the hope didn't last. The study was quickly met with criticism. The shawl had never been officially recorded as crime scene evidence. It had been handled and displayed for decades, vulnerable to every kind of contamination. And mitochondrial DNA isn't unique. It can be shared by millions across the globe. In the end, modern science offered more questions than answers. No uncontested evidence, no documented confession, no confirmed remains. The puzzle remains without its final piece. And Jack remains faceless. An invisible face. Jack the Ripper was not just a killer. He was a phantom born of a dark era, forged by poverty, fueled by neglect, and shielded by chaos. Perhaps he was a lone madman. Perhaps an evil genius hidden in plain sight. Or perhaps he was many. Or no one at all. What we have today are names, hypotheses, theories, and doubts stacked like the headlines of 1,888. But one truth remains. Someone killed 5 women with surgical precision. Someone vanished into the fog without a trace. And perhaps he died laughing, with the secret forever buried. Psychology of the killer, criminal profile. The deep cuts, surgical precision, and absolute silence at the crime scenes all pointed to one thing. Jack the Ripper was no ordinary killer. He planned, he watched, he selected his victims carefully, and vanished without a trace. The murders reveal a psychological profile that is meticulous and predatory. Jack was cold, methodical, and driven by targeted hatred likely toward women, especially prostitutes. The mutilation of sexual organs and the display of bodies suggest a need for domination, humiliation, and symbolic expression. Modern experts believe he would be classified today as an organized psychopath, highly intelligent, possibly with anatomical experience, and a craving for absolute control. When compared to modern serial killers like Ted Bundy or Dennis Rader, BTK, Jack shares common traits: ritualistic behavior, emotional detachment, and an apparently normal life outside the murders. It was during this very manhunt that a milestone emerged: the birth of criminal profiling as a science. Investigators like Dr. Thomas Bond attempted to draft one of history's first psychological profiles, the earliest roots of what would become the FBI's behavioral science unit decades later. Jack left more than bodies. He left behind a new field of study and a brutal reminder. Real monsters don't always roar. Sometimes they whisper. The cultural legacy and the birth of the myth. He murdered 5 women in the dark alleys of a forgotten London, and yet he survived the passage of time like few killers in history. Jack the Ripper is no longer just a criminal, he's an icon. A macabre myth explored for generations in films, television shows, novels, comics, video games, and endless theories. He's been portrayed as a vampire, an aristocrat, an alien, and even the anti-hero of futuristic thrillers. Fiction overtook reality, and the monster became a character. The question is, why? Perhaps because Jack represents fear in its purest form. The fear of the unseen, the random, the faceless evil. Since his emergence, popular culture has never looked at a murderer the same way. He created the archetype of the modern serial killer. Intelligent, methodical, mysterious, and, to a disturbing extent, captivating. He sparked the world's fascination with studying, documenting, even romanticizing serial killers. But in turning fear into entertainment, society risks forgetting who the true protagonists of this story were: the victims. Poor women, marginalized, invisible until their blood stained the streets and shocked the world. Jack became famous. They were given gravestones, and that may be the most unsettling legacy of all. Modern advances is the case closed. More than a century later, Jack's shadow still hangs over London. But now, instead of gas lamps and notebooks, investigators rely on genetic databases, digital forensics, and cutting-edge technology. The question remains the same. Can the case finally be closed? Despite all the advances, the case remains officially unsolved, and it may always be. The lack of solid evidence, the disappearance of original materials, and the passage of time have turned the Ripper into something greater than a killer. He has become an enigma. Science may come close, but the full truth? That may have been buried with him. And so, Jack remains where he always has, on the border between reality and myth. 5 women brutally murdered. A city consumed by fear. An investigation marked by failure, conflict, and silence. Mysterious letters, wild theories, suspects never brought to justice. And a name that still echoes like a chilling whisper from the past: Jack the Ripper. Over 135 years later, we're still trying to piece together the puzzle. Science has advanced. Analyses have evolved. Books have been written, films made, theories overturned. But the truth remains out of reach. And the final question still lingers. Will we ever know who he was? Maybe. But maybe that's not even the most important question. Because the real mystery isn't just Jack's identity. It's how society allowed this to happen. How so many women were ignored until it was too late. How fear was exploited. How blood became spectacle. Jack disappeared. But the marks he left were not only on his victims, they were left on us. If you enjoyed the video, make sure to hit the like button and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss what's coming next.